I'd like to start off our second day with panel 5, the Bible and Achaemenid religions, with a brief introduction to our first speaker, Professor Mark Lufster, who I had the pleasure of meeting 2 days ago when he came and gave another talk on a really wonderful talk for the Frankel Center. Professor Lufster comes to us from Temple University, where he's the director of Jewish Studies and teaches in the Department of Religion. He's published widely and incredibly deeply. I was just sort of bowled over by your bibliography, to be perfectly honest. On subjects related to, as he describes in his own bio, mythology and in ancient Israel and Second Temple Judaism and the phenomenon of prophecy in the ancient Near East, as well as the formation of the Hebrew Bible and the history of Israelite priesthood, including, for example, his 2017 book, The Levites and the Boundaries of Israelite Identity. The most recent of his many books, which just came out last year, 2024, with Oxford University Press, is An Empire Far and Wide, the Achaemenid Dynastic Myth and Jewish Scribes in the Late Persian Period. He'll be talking to us today on, quote, the place of Achaemenid tradition in Second Temple Judaism, the challenge for Jewish studies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I've had a remarkable time in Los Angeles with all of you. Also, happy Pi Day, because when I was in 11th grade, as an extra credit assignment, I memorized pi to 65 decimal places, and then went on to perform it at parties, which gives you a sense of what my social life was like in high school. All right, as it happens, I don't have any PowerPoints to accompany this paper, which is really a metacritical examination of trends in the field of Jewish studies that relate to the topic of our conference, with a special focus on the study of Second Temple Judaism. So I'm just going to start. So there's this old joke. A Jewish man is stranded alone on a desert island for decades. Eventually, a ship spots him and sends a rescue party to the island. Upon arriving, they discover that this Jewish man has constructed not one, but 2 synagogues. They ask him why he's done this. The man stands by one, points to the other, and says, "You couldn't pay me enough money to go to services at that place." The joke is near mythic in the Jewish world and has emerged in various forms for as long as I can remember. It speaks to something that has come up during this conference, namely that Jewishness is a matter of diversification and classification, and those classifications can sometimes manifest in polarizing ways. On a more serious note, recent international events have polarized the Jewish world more dramatically, especially with regard to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the Hamas massacre of October 7th. What I want to note is that in all of this, some more religious and politically conservative-minded Jews have labeled Jews on the left, quote, un-Jews. That is, they forfeit their ethnicity by supporting groups and causes deemed a threat to the tribe. Spinoza would, of course, have much to say on this, and so would evolutionary anthropologists. I draw attention to it here because, despite the label un-Jew, the only real criteria required for being assigned this label is to be a Jew. The tautology in this circle game would drive Joni Mitchell crazy. Now, if the Jews and their institutions don't really know what it is that makes a Jew, other than being a Jew or threatening Jewishness from within the Jewish community in such a way that they're no longer Jewish but yet somehow still Jews, then how the hell can academics figure it out? Well, we try. And we like to make ourselves feel confident by claiming that we possess the critical tools to get the job done more efficiently than insiders with their insiderisms. But our tools and criteria are a result of our own insiderisms as well. George Lakoff, the great cognitive scientist and professor emeritus at Berkeley, would refer to these tools and the assumptions empowering them as frames, cognitive mechanisms that govern how we categorize and assign meaning to knowledge. You can't think without frames. Every person here uses them. We need to, otherwise we cannot perceive or experience sentient consciousness. But your frames and my frames may not be the same. One of the frames I've been struggling with relates to the topic of our conference, and that is how to understand the Persian period as an epoch of Jewish history within the area of Second Temple Judaism scholarship. On this, there is much division. To my mind, and as I argue in my recent book, the Persian period is a fertile era for exploring the conditions of nascent Jewish identity. In the Persian period, there are Jews, and there is a set of phenomenological categories that we can justifiably call Judaism. Now, that Judaism evolves and shifts over time. It morphs into something else, as new frames and iterations emerge in shifting circumstances. But it's there, and to deny that is dumb. This is a different perspective than those offered by scholars who argue that we can only speak of Judaism with the emergence of the Talmud, or that we can only speak of Jewishness as an ethnic hallmark of the Hellenistic period. I disagree, but I don't think those perspectives are dumb. They each operate within a very particular cognitive framework where the domain of Judaism or Jewishness is predicated on specific factors, some of which cannot be placed in the Persian period. Where things get dumb is when people say that these frames are immutable truths rather than working definitions for the boundaries of a specific critical enterprise. To make the claim of immutability in this way, and then to apply it to the period we are discussing here, is arbitrary and, again, tautological. That is, one can't speak of Judaism in the Persian period because there was no Judaism in the Persian period. Narishkeit, as my Yiddish-speaking grandmother would say. This all has some serious bearing on the question of the resonances and sustaining notes of Achaemenid tradition: political, linguistic, cultural, mythological, and for the purposes of my talk today, cognitive. Not only throughout the ensuing Second Temple period, but also in the scholarly study of that period, and that's what I want to focus on. Seth Schwartz's 2000 book, Imperialism and Jewish Society, provides a brief sketch of the backstory to the emergence of Judaism, beginning with the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods, before embarking on the meat and potatoes of his study, that is, the Hellenistic and Roman periods. For Schwartz, it is the encounter with imperialism that forges responses within the world of Bnei Yisrael that leads to the construction of Jewish identity. And I think he's right. I've recently argued that Jewishness is very much the result of the encounter with international imperialism. Both post-colonial and cognitive research provides strong support for this. But as we've already seen in the papers presented at this conference, this is already happening in the Persian period. Why, though, does this seem to be a difficult thing for so many Second Temple Judaism scholars to countenance? Let me give you an example. As I mentioned the other day in the graduate seminar sponsored by the Levy Center, Annette Yoshiko-Reed recently argued that Jewish literature really emerges with the making of lists and study of cosmic hierarchies that suddenly explodes in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE among Jewish scribes. She's not wrong, but this is happening in the Persian period too. Take exactly 5 minutes to look at the genealogical information in Chronicles, or the lists of individuals, offices, and groups in Nehemiah 7 through 12. And it becomes clear that these texts are doing exactly what Reed argues is phenomenologically unique to the Hellenistic period. But she doesn't really look to this early period, and neither does Schwartz, except in only a very preliminary way. One has to wonder what hinders an exploration of Persian period material by prominent and even agenda-setting scholars of Second Temple Judaism. Now, before I go on, let me address something that has become somewhat trendy among some colleagues, and that is to date a substantial amount or even most of Ezra, Nehemiah, or Chronicles to the Hellenistic period. I don't want to spend much time discussing this, but in brief, this is untenable. From the cognitive perspective, literature produced under a foreign empire cannot but utilize the cultural frames of that empire, its language, its mythologies, its organization of space, its periodization of time, etc. And I'll give an example right now that I gave during the graduate seminar a couple days ago. I'm going to challenge you all to do something right now. Don't think of an elephant. Can't be done. This is an experiment that George Lakoff does when he gives his public lectures. Once I introduce the word elephant, you can only think of an elephant when you try not to think of an elephant. And in the context of an imperial culture, it is impossible not to have the empire affect the way that you think about it, even when you're trying not to think about it. So, Paul Kosman recently discussed what these things look like in the Hellenistic period, and virtually none of it is in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Are there signs of Hellenistic era transmission in these works? Yes, but that's not the same thing as compositional origin. Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles are Persian period works and bear the hallmark of that empire's mythology, not post-Alexandrian frameworks. So I'll come back now to the question I asked above. Why do scholars of Second Temple Judaism tend to forget that many of the things they see as characteristic of that period surface not under Greek rule, but under the Achaemenid, under the Achaemenids and their ideological standards and practices? Here's another question. Anybody in this room ever been to an AJS meeting? A couple of you, yeah. The Hebrew Bible people are really odd person out at that conference. We're like the table of unpopular cousins at a wedding, placed right near the entrance to the kitchen and as far away from the dance floor as possible. Sure, they tolerate us, but we are few in number, and besides, we were all just at SBL and that was our moment to flex. But AJS, not our circus, not our monkeys. It's only been recently that this has started to change, but the institutional framework is still in place. And really, it's still in place even at SBL. Second Temple Judaism sessions are typically distinct from Persian period sessions. I experienced this divide in a somewhat unpleasant way when I gave a paper at a Persian period session recently and tried talking about the early Enoch material only to get some serious harumphs from some folks who didn't want to hear no darn-fangled talk about that Hellenistic stuff. In fact, after I delivered the paper, which is now forthcoming in the journal Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel, a prominent scholar came up to me afterwards and actually scolded me for trying to drag the Persian period into the Hellenistic. I can't forget the impression that this left on me because it followed an experience about a year earlier during my time at the University of Michigan, where I was a Frankel Center fellow alongside Professor Bonishow. During our fellowship, several well-known Second Temple Judaism scholars zoomed into our seminar room to each have special sessions with us. One of them made a hard and steadfast distinction between biblical literature and Second Temple literature. I noted in the Zoom chat that plenty of biblical texts were Second Temple texts. The scholar admitted this, but quickly moved on. It wasn't worth more extensive exploration. But the conversation that really stood out to me during that time was facilitated by another very important scholar of Second Temple Judaism, who made a claim that I think is really at the heart of the problem I'm addressing here. He said that like the British Eton School boys who grew up studying Latin classics, he had grown up in the Orthodox Jewish world studying rabbinic texts, and this granted him a special insight and understanding into their contents that ordinary scholars without such personal religious background could never possess. In other words, scholarly training for non-religious Jews or Gentiles could never provide the deep understanding that he, as a religious Jew, had for these rabbinic texts. Now, I immediately chimed in and made clear that this was baloney, because I grew up in exactly the same environment, and I couldn't bring anything valuable to the scholarly study of those same rabbinic texts until I did my academic training, and my thesis director was a Jesuit priest, for crying out loud. To be sure, growing up in a religious Jewish environment gives you a familiarity with a wide spectrum of classical Jewish texts, and you can probably cite and recite them with relative ease. But that personal background doesn't grant some special midichlorian count that makes you more powerful with the Force in an academic setting, and it bothers me that some scholars think this way. What was intriguing about that very important scholar's statement, though, is that he did not extend this to the study of biblical texts. His Jedi powers related to rabbinic, not biblical literature. In modern scholarship, rabbinic thought is more strongly connected to the study of the Second Temple period than it is to the study of Iron Age Israel and the Hebrew Bible. Obviously, historical chronology accounts for much of this, but once again, I think this speaks to an uncertainty about the Persian period, the era where so much of what became the Hebrew Bible was stabilized and categorized. It's also an era in which so much of what became the tradition inherited by the rabbis was forged. But the cognitive framework in which so many Second Temple Judaism scholars tend to operate does not provide accommodations for the fact that the Persian period both transcends and connects these areas of study. The rabbinic texts actually sort of know this. One major rabbinic foundation myth, that which opens Mishnah Avot, traces rabbinic concepts of Torah to the men of the Great Assembly, that is, the scribal circles of the late Persian period. It is the figure of Ezra that the rabbis view as their own intellectual patron saint, and again, especially in the Tannaitic literature, Ezra is placed within the temple as a trustee and overseer. Rabbinic philology and hermeneutics are also a matter of Persian period influence, and on more than one occasion, the rabbis are depicted as engaging in mantic scholarly activity that is characteristic of the scholarly study and adaptation of textual lemmas which obtained under Persian cultural auspices. As I've discussed in my recent book, the Persian period and the impact of the Achaemenids sits uncomfortably in scholarship because in the context of the Second Temple period, Hellenism carries a different cultural valence than Persian imperialism. Mesopotamian scholarship existed in the former, but it occupied a different place, politically and cosmically, than it did for the Achaemenids. The Greeks were something new and strange and grand and different and just smurfy. By contrast, the Achaemenids saw themselves as a type of Neo-Assyrian empire, replete with an emphasis on old Mesopotamian learning that emulated the learned elites and royal mythos of that earlier imperial society. And though it was under Persia that the Second Temple period commenced, the empire began before the construction of this temple, and thus before the regeneration of the community defined by it. The Persian period, therefore, straddles the Second Temple period and the era before it, one that is ill-defined and amorphous for a number of reasons. For many Second Temple Judaism scholars, this has led to a cognitive framework that does not include the Persian period within the parameters of the domain that delineates Second Temple Judaism. There's a connection, but it's fuzzy, and it's often relegated to some proto-period where the ingredients of Second Temple Judaism were still cooking, a category of proto-Judaism that somehow sits with the late monarchic and exilic periods, though only in the most schematic and abstract ways. It's for this reason, too, that these scholars tend to identify Jewishness and Judaism only with later periods. If Judaism and Jewishness require strict definitions, then the Persian period's inherent lack of definition, in their view, cannot really enter the discussion. Now, conversely, at least one stream of Hebrew Bible scholarship has frequently looked to the Persian period as categorically different, other, and implicitly inferior to the Iron Age. A former colleague in Hebrew Bible at Temple University used to tell a joke that was told to him by one of his teachers that a Bible lacking the books of Chronicles or Ezra-Nehemiah was still viable as a scholarly and confessional resource because those books don't really matter. That is, books written in the Persian period were merely Jewish mimetic echoes of the more authentic stuff from the good old monarchic and pre-monarchic periods. Echoes of Wellhausen's anti-Semitism can be found in such an attitude, and much can be said about how this reinforces supersessionist presuppositions regarding texts, dating, and historical critical approaches. But in both cases, certain academic orthodoxies demand artificial periodization of time that make assumptions about the Persian period, the Achaemenid imperial ideology, and responses to their hegemony among the subject populations of Judah, or Yehud. The Persian period is either too early to be able to say anything about its contribution to the study of Second Temple Judaism, or it is late and characterized by a Judaism that is somehow derivative and even parasitic, and thus not worth really studying. It's clear to me that because these approaches cancel each other out so completely, neither of them carry any real worth on their own. The methodological boundaries we tend to construct within our disciplines restrict us in ways that are self-defeating. Second Temple Judaism scholars who focus on the Hellenistic character of Jewish thought would do well to expand their horizons and ask how Persian imperialism created cognitive, cultural, ritual, linguistic, aesthetic, poetic, political, and sociological frames that continue to affect the development of Judaism in the post-Alexandrian period. And Hebrew Bible scholars who tend to dismiss the Persian period as distinct from Iron Age tradition would be well served by considering the consequences of the Iron Age as taken up and reinforced by the Persian Empire. Jewish sources from this time are essential. They're not tertiary or derivative works, but they're witnesses to ancient ethnogenesis and cultural mythopaesis. I can easily envision how this simple enterprise would have immediate ramifications for the work Second Temple Judaism scholars do. Reed's work on demonology and Jewish scribalism would resonate more expansively when the implications of Persian imperial myth, especially that enshrined in the Behistun inscription and its description of Drauga, are taken into consideration. Likewise, the confidence espoused by the very important scholar I mentioned earlier that Orthodox education constitutes some special intellectual ninjutsu might be curbed when thinking about how distinct imperial cultures impose discrete cognitive frameworks that affect the study of these sources. Because I promise you, yeshiva bookers do not study that stuff. Finally, Schwartz might have to think more carefully about the way Jewish responses to Greek and Roman imperialism build on earlier responses cemented into Jewish consciousness throughout 2 centuries of Persian imperialism, dominated by Achaemenid aesthetics and myth, but also the inherent liminal qualifications this imposed on an evolving and unstable Jewish identity. Now, I don't think any of this is really all that hard to do. It just requires challenging certain axioms that have led scholars into silos of thinking that shut down critical imagination. And without that sense of imagination, without the impulse to ask what if, we risk staying in those silos and growing stale from the lack of intellectual oxygen. Both Mika Ahuvia and Blossom Stefania have drawn attention to the need for critical fabulation to expand our conceptual horizons. It means taking some risks, maybe making suggestions that elicit an eye roll or some other physical expression of intellectual discomfort at an SBL meeting. Maybe it requires being just a little stupid. at a point of a conference just like this one. But as one of our great poets, at least in my point of view, said about 40 years ago, and I quote, "You can be a coffee achiever. You can sit around the house and watch Leave It to Beaver. The future's up to you. So what you going to do? Dare to be stupid." Thank you.